You know it. You love it. It's the Unexplained Mystery Iceberg. It's this super long monstrosity with like 700 entries on it. So without further ado, let's take a look at Tier 4. This guy randomly posted some new, really clear 9/11 footage on YouTube. The video was uploaded February 24th, 2022. The video starts with some confused people standing on what appears to be a boat with the towers visible in the background. You see the plane approach and slam directly into the second tower, causing a large explosion. This is probably some of the clearest footage of 9/11 I've ever seen, and it's kind of jarring. I'm about to show the video, and I figured I'd give advanced warning. Even though most American younger millennials and Gen Z are used to seeing graphic footage every year at school on 9/11. Or like me, you watched it happen live on the Rolly TV. Redditors apparently found the posters linked in, and he's worked for the Department of Defense and Boeing. And a lot of commenters were really grasping at straws trying to find coincidences like something about the Ukraine war. And of course a lot of people are speculating that he only had such a good view because he knew it was going to happen. And then there are the other commenters who are like, in one of his other videos, I saw him holding 2 pints of Guinness, which represents the Guinness World Record held by the Twin Towers. Here's an excuse for me to bring this guy back out. But to me it seems like he was just able to release this footage now that he's retired. Did some prehistoric humans hibernate in order to survive long, harsh winters? I know I do. An article run by The Guardian in 2020 suggests that perhaps they did. This theory comes from remains that were found at an archaeological dig site in Spain. The bones at the site showed markings consistent with animals that hibernate as a result of the change in metabolic processes during this dormant period. These lesions would indicate that bone growth slowed down considerably for a few months at a time each year. And there are primate species known to hibernate. There is no evidence of prehistoric humans in harsher climates like Siberia or northern Canada having hibernated, likely because they had a different set of animals to hunt. So they were able to have food and pelts during the winter. However, some researchers counter that many large mammals are not able to fully hibernate, and they instead go into a lesser version of prolonged sleep called torpor. And in that state, the body would still be consuming enough energy to pose a problem. 2 wolf-themed entries in 1 week? What did we do to deserve this? Pavagada is a town in Karnataka, India, known primarily for its historic fort and its large-scale solar production. But back in the 80s, this town was subject to a series of gruesome deaths. In the span of just 2 years, 11 people, mostly children, were killed, which is a lot based on the town's total population, with similar reports from surrounding towns during the same time period. The first incident happened in 1983 with a 5-year-old girl disappearing from her bed in the middle of the night. And in the following weeks, 6 more young girls would go missing. Large paw prints were sometimes found in the area of the home, but without any signs of struggle. And in the event that remains were found, it was usually just a single body part. Everyone chalked it up to wolves or hyenas, and citizens began to hunt the animals. This seemed to put a temporary stop to the attacks, but another was reported a few months later. Dogs were used to track the scent of the missing person to a cave just outside of town, but nothing was found there. However, some locals turned to urban legends claiming that the victims had been taken as some sort of ritualistic sacrifice, particularly because so many of them were young girls. But to this day, nobody knows exactly what happened. Would you recognize your younger self if you passed by them on the street? For today's entry, we find ourselves on the Let's Not Meet subreddit. We've been here before on previous episodes, like that bridge in Wales. This post was made 11 years ago by user JackSprat90 about his experience in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. He was born in the area and spent his childhood hiking and exploring with his dad, so he was fairly familiar with the terrain. He specifically recalls frequenting the area of Goblin Creek to fish and collect rocks. And he specifically described the kind of rock that he and his friends would go looking for. And because I'm abnormal about rocks, I had to figure out specifically what it was. And I'm like 90% sure it was Tahoma jasper. Anyway, that's not relevant. What is relevant is that he almost never saw other people in this area. One time when he was 14, he had been down at the creek and was walking back up the trail with his bounty of rocks in a backpack. He encountered a man in his 30s walking in the other direction, and both of them seemed startled to encounter another person out there. But then the man did a double take and started staring at him intently, kind of freaked out. 14-year-old OP was wondering if this man could have been some distant relative because of how familiar he looked. Then about 15 years later, he was visiting family and wanted to hike out to the creek for old times. And on his way down the trail, he encountered a teenage boy with a backpack full of rocks. He did a double take and realized the boy looked so much like he did at that age. Once he realized what he had just experienced, he tried to catch up to the boy, but he was nowhere to be found. Yay, it's another stupid-ass cube. Y'all know I've got a bias against cube-themed entries ever since my arch-nemesis, Mooncube. This time, the cube is squishy. And British. One day, two brothers were out walking, and as they crossed the London Bridge, they saw something strange down in the water. It was a gelatinous cube. It was grayish in color and appeared to be gently swimming along. It was about 5 feet long and had tentacles of some sort. It looked like a big square jellyfish. One of the brothers described it as having something mechanical about it, but didn't elaborate. They watched it for a few minutes until it disappeared under the surface of the water. They had tried to take photos of it, but apparently had to zoom in so much you couldn't distinguish any features. According to their recounting of the event, a small crowd had gathered to point and look at the thing. So there were theoretically other witnesses. About a year later, one of the brothers was in the area again with his young son, who freaked out and asked to leave because there was something scary in the water. While there is a small chance that an errant jellyfish somehow ended up in the river, I'm gonna assume it was just some weird-looking garbage. 1913 miners claim there was a centaur down there, and it could drive. This story ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1913, and it's one of those instances that it's short enough I can just read it to you. Inquirer. Katanning, Pennsylvania, March 9th. Scoffs and jeers have failed to shake the belief of 300 miners employed in the Chickasaw mine here that it was a genuine wraith that went from room to room in the workings last Friday, and in a voice commanded them to drop their tools and go. The celerity with which the order was obeyed marks a record for dispatch. Terrified workers poured in droves from the mine entrance. According to the men, the upper half of the ghostly visitor's body was like that of an emaciated man, while the lower half resembled the hindquarters of a horse. In one hand it carried what apparently was a dinner pail from which streamed lurid gleams of light. Put the thesaurus away, my boy. John Martell, driver of the mine motor, was at his place on the machine, when that ghastly thing, coming seemingly from nowhere, pointed a skinny finger and uttered one word. Go! Martell could not go, for a moment. He was too scared. As soon as he got control of his legs, he gave a shriek and dashed down the track towards the mine opening. The motor, driven by the specter, was following, he says. When he reached daylight, the motor was close behind, but empty. He declares he heard a blood-curdling laugh. The miners refused to go to work the next day. What they will do tomorrow has not been decided. When you and your coworkers all agree on some fabricated nonsense so you can go home early? A mysterious ARG that has yet to be solved. I'm skipping 129 because there was not enough to make a whole video. It's literally just, in the Bible there's a gap of time where we don't know what Jesus was up to. Perhaps he was in Southeast Asia. The end. So that brings us to the Tin Man mystery. A 2015 ARG, alternate reality game, that originated on YouTube. An account with the username Tin Man began posting a series of videos that were just a bunch of numbers. The numbers across the series of 10 videos were able to be decoded to say, I am the Tin Man. Found the code? Good. Then you've heard that the messages are playing backwards. Remember, there are always deeper meanings. The first one is for the gullible fools that can't see. That can't hear the second meaning he is calling out to us. Because it's dark, and grief is only the start. You must realign and hurry forth. If you have listened, this fair grace will bestow. We must quickly carry out the missions set before us. As was alluded to in this message, playing the videos backwards and messing with the audio revealed more clues. About a month later, another batch of these videos was uploaded with more obscure hints. Altered audio from a JFK speech was hidden in there, along with Morse code reminding you to drink Ovaltine. Just like in A Christmas Story. I actually desperately want one of these lamps, but they're like $200. references to the French name for a German cipher. The German cipher could then be used to decode the URL to a hidden video of a woman in a jail cell. There we get to see the Tin Man himself on his Riddler grind set. And then he uploads another set of videos. The message can be decoded to mean, the game is over, now the hard work begins. The remainder has yet to be decoded, and there have been no more posts. Better keep an eye out for fairies lest they make you sick or steal your kids. Well, in this case, she was more of an accessory to the kids stealing, but you know. Fairies, also known as the Fae, exist in some form throughout most of European folklore. But they haven't always been the pretty fun fairies marketed to children.
And then, no!
What is the Tooth Fairy doing with all those teeth? In the olden days, they had a reputation of being troublesome rascals at best and actively malicious at worst, with a penchant for trickery. In the old superstitions, a fairy blast was a sudden gust of wind attributed to the fae or spirits that would bring disease. This can likely be attributed to the uptick in things like respiratory infections during the colder, windier months, as well as early understandings of medicine. We're talking 4 humors, baby. A state of good health was associated with characteristics like warm and wet. So the cold, dry wind was not healthy. The concept of being struck by the fairies was also applied to sudden onset conditions like an aneurysm or seizure, and that person was essentially marked to be stolen away to the fairy world. Real ones might remember the Jetpack Man episode with the Jack Skellington balloons. We've got another Jetpack Man! Or could it be the same one? In Kazakhstan in 1936, on her way to school, a teenage girl spotted something strange overhead. It's Jetpack Man. Upon taking a closer look, it appeared to be a man in a black jumpsuit with a helmet, and he was wearing a very noisy, oval-shaped backpack. She watched curiously until he started flying directly at her. She started to run off to hide, but when she glanced behind her, he was nowhere to be seen. And for context, the idea of a jetpack didn't really exist in the public consciousness yet. Theories range from aliens to time travel to secret military technology to people lie sometimes. Speaking of lying, my theory is that it was the world's first Jack Skellington balloon. It seems this guy found a real-life SCP. In November 2021, on Twitter, I swear to God, you will never catch me calling it X. User Tommy Tweets For You claims to have found this book, The Discipline of a Psychic Warrior. Where did he find it? He says in the dumpster behind the Pentagon. So presumably like in a thrift store or something. It doesn't have a name for the author, but it has his social security number. And it appears to have been published in 1978 by The Foundation. Some inquisitive little detectives figured out that the actual author is Ralph Paulson, whoever that is. The first page says, "This book is dedicated to those who will suffer and die in the struggle to save our planet." Have you or a loved one suffered or died? The list of chapters is wild. Pause to read. We out here reunifying Ireland, stopping a tornado, and then getting euthanized. The book states that its goals are 1. To avoid mutually assured nuclear destruction. 2. Make the US somewhat more pleasant to live in. And 3. Have fun and be yourself. Not making that up. And it seems old Tommy Tweets has scanned and uploaded the whole thing in PDF form. I'll try to link it below to whatever extent the app gods will allow. I haven't read it because I'm still trying to rebuild some synapses after that Council of 13 video. Can you believe it? We're doing an explained one today. Well, I actually found 2 phantom snipers. One was unexplained, but there was a lot less to say about it. That one was in 1920 in New Jersey, and somebody was using compressed air to shoot blue marbles into buses. Anyway, in the 1950s, Los Angeles was plagued by its own phantom sniper, hiding in bushes and alleyways to shoot at random women. The culprit was Evan Charles Thomas of Akron, Ohio. He and I are the same age in this picture. He grew up a lonely, sickly child, missing a lot of school due to his chronic medical issues. Same. He dropped out of school after 8th grade to work on a celery farm. Not same. He then served in the Air Force during World War II. After returning home, he moved to California, got married, and had 2 children. After working an overnight shift at the railroad, he was returning home early one morning when he saw a woman in a phone booth. He grabbed the rifle he kept in his back seat and hid in a grove of avocado trees. He only intended to frighten her, but accidentally wounded her. And something about that excited him. The following night, he shot through the window of a random home, and thankfully no one was injured. Sometime later, his wife and children were out of town, and he was feeling a little bored and on edge. So he went out and found his victim, a woman drinking coffee at a restaurant. He intended to shoot the cup out of her hand, but accidentally shot her in the head, killing her instantly. And that was extra thrilling for him. In the following months, he shot a little girl waiting for her school bus, a woman gardening, and a woman doing chores in the kitchen. His downfall came when he targeted his own neighbor. He was caught and easily confessed to all the shootings, almost proudly. His wife, pregnant with their 3rd child, divorced him. He was tried in July 1952 and sentenced to death. In January 1954, he had a final meal of cereal, ham, eggs, canned cherries, hash browns, and coffee before being executed by gas chamber. A lot of people were trying to blame his behavior on his childhood, but I certainly don't go around shooting random strangers. Perhaps if he had an internet to act stupid on, things would have turned out differently. Ooh, so scary. Back in 2019, random bundles of hair were being found around Santa Barbara, particularly in center lane dividers of a few specific roads. And based on descriptions, it sounds like they were everywhere. I was imagining like a random hair extension on the ground. I've seen plenty of these, but they were actually very neat. People described them as having the texture of coarse human hair or horse hair. Coarse? Horse. Of course, people were quick to jump to the nefarious explanations of things like witchcraft or serial killer trophies. A local news station apparently asked some cosmetologists, and they said, And as a licensed cosmetologist myself, I'm used to seeing braiding hair packaged like this, but I saw several places online selling it like this. So I think it's fair to assume that it's just a bunch of braiding hair that fell off a truck. We've been positively overdue for another rascal. I know, we've been positively deprived of goofy little characters, but we're gonna fix that. Unless you count me, in which case there's always a goofy little character. Oh, what's that? You've had enough of goofy little characters? Keep scrolling, loser. You know how people will describe the location of their small town relative to the next largest city? Well, this entry takes place in Studham, which the news article describes as just south of Dunstable. Very cool. That means nothing to me. Psst, it's me, future Anne. I googled it, and it's an hour northwest of London. That does mean something. Yay! Well, in 1967, 6 little boys were out and about in Studham. They were doing a little bit of whatever boys do when a blue lightning bolt struck nearby. And something landed along with it. What did those young lads see? A 3-foot-tall blue man wearing a suit and a bowler hat. Somebody get this man a ticket to Paris so he can meet his red counterpart. Also, he was glowing a bit, because of course he was. They're turning around in my driveway again? And also, he teleported a little bit. He'd vanish in a puff of smoke and then pop back up over there. The boys kept trying to catch him and he'd teleport just out of their grasp. They think he was trying to communicate with them telepathically, but they couldn't understand him. So I'm going to assume he was saying, "Unhand me with your sticky little child mitts." Or, "Somebody needs to go ahead and invent Cocomelon to get these kids away from me." And we know every bit of this was true, because kids never make things up. We have back-to-back rascals this week. Are you excited? The iceberg spoils us so. It's a giant Scottish caterpillar. Oh, oops, hold on. Giant Scottish caterpillar. It's the kind of story you'd tell your kids so they stay in your yard. Also, here he is in Final Fantasy. He hangs out in fruit trees waiting for unruly children to wander too far from home. He's the size of a large dog and lives in a hole in the ground. If he catches you stealing fruit, he'll snatch your naughty ass up and drag you back to his lair. Watch out, Mr. Caterpillar, lest I pull an Uno reverse on you. I'm taking you to the vet and getting you microchipped. I'll put him in a sweater and put a sock on each of his little feet. He will look positively dashing in the Christmas card. In my research, I also found the gooseberry wife, a different large caterpillar from the Isle of Man who does exactly the same thing, but gooseberries only. Are they married? Was there a caterpillar wedding? Was I not invited? The caterpillars must be really busy, because they had to outsource hazelnut security to a little goblin called Melch Dick. Melch Dick. And then we got Lazy Lawrence, who will make you feel lethargic and sick if you eat stolen apples. Seeing how everyone reacted to the loquat trees outside my middle school, I understand why the creatures were necessary. You know how you sometimes hear about kids saying they remember their past life? That's already weird enough, but this guy said he remembered his past life on Mars. Boris Kiprianovich, nicknamed Boriska, was born January 11th, 1996 in Volgograd, Russia, making him 15 days younger than me. Capricorn's on top, baby. He was a very intelligent child, passing milestones like speaking and reading a lot earlier than most. He loved astronomy, but his parents weren't sure where he learned about it. And then he was featured in a Russian newspaper at age 7. While on a camping trip with his family, he wandered up to a group of researchers sitting around a fire at a nearby campsite, and he told them all about his life on Mars. He described ancient civilizations, megalithic cities, spacecraft, and planetary systems. He claims that the Martian civilizations destroyed their atmosphere with nuclear war. He brought up the supposed lost civilization of Lemuria, claiming to have visited frequently in a past life. He talked about the Mayan Empire and ancient Egypt, claiming there are secrets about the pyramid and the Sphinx that we are yet to discover. Apparently something behind the Sphinx's ear can be opened. If you're watching this and you have access to the Sphinx, can you, check? If you find something cool back there, you are contractually obligated to tell me. He also revealed a lot of concepts that you hear about from the New Age spirituality crowd, saying that he's part of a batch of children that were born to help Earth through a transitional phase, and some stuff about magnetic pole shifts. Just in general, a lot of information that a 7-year-old boy in 2004 would probably not have access to. And then he kind of faded into obscurity, and journalists have had a really hard time trying to find him. Boris, if you're watching this, please hit me up. Ooh, it's a Canadian ghost ship. It's a short newspaper article. I'll read it. You know the drill. The government have received the following reply to the inquiry made at Newfoundland concerning the vessels seen, or supposed to have been seen, by the crew of the Renovation. Government House, St. John's, Newfoundland, May 6th. Sir, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of Mr. Merivale's dispatch of the 16th of April, 1852, together with its enclosure from the Board of Admiralty respecting 2 vessels reported to have been seen on a field of ice attached to an iceberg off Newfoundland, and which it is surmised may possibly be Sir John Franklin's ships, and in compliance with the instructions therein contained, I have caused inquiries to be made through the Commercial Society of St. John's, but can obtain no information whatever relative to the above described vessels. I enclose herein a letter received from the President of the Chamber of Commerce, and I share in the opinion therein expressed, that it is well nigh impossible that 2 vessels on a field of ice attached to an iceberg of the magnitude and description spoken of by the men of the Renovation could have passed along this coast from the north and have reached the latitude of Cape Race without having been seen either by some of the numerous sealing vessels which intersect the field of ice in the months of March and April, or by some of the many vessels that pass this island at that season on their way to or from the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick. I have read 3 sentences so far. In the season of 1851, no vessels engaged in the seal fishery of this island were lost, and therefore I agree in the opinion that there must have been some misapprehension on the part of the persons who supposed they had seen such vessels, occasioned perhaps by the deceptive appearance that icebergs assume under some peculiar action of the atmosphere. Whereas, had the inquiry been made with reference to the spring of this year, not 2, but many vessels may have been seen in positions somewhat similar to that described by the men of the Renovation. For, owing to 2 disastrous gales in the last month, very great damage has been sustained by our sealing fleet, and out of 400 vessels engaged in that fishery, upwards of 60 have either foundered or been abandoned at sea among the field ice, and many of the derelicts have, after being deserted by their own crews, been brought in by those of other vessels. And vessels have also been dispatched by the local government in search of others, and to bring off from different parts of the coast the shipwrecked sealers amounting nearly to 3,000 in number. And that was one more sentence. We've had 4 sentences so far. So the crew of a ship saw 2 other ships, and everyone's like, I don't know what ships you're talking about. Yeah. I had to root around in an entire book of Strange Creatures from Time and Space by John Keel for this one, about aliens and stuff, including some articles he wrote for Playboy about aliens and stuff. In a chapter called The Hairy Ones, he described all different flavors of squatch, and somehow relates them to unidentified flying objects. He says that the special limited edition Winter Squatch, the Abominable Snowman, or as he has abbreviated it, ABSM, has the most supporting evidence. And he describes an ABSM encounter from Canada in the late 1800s. Way out in the middle of nowhere, some railroad workers encountered what they thought to be a guy sleeping in the middle of the tracks. Then they got a better look at him. He was described as 7 feet tall and super extra hairy, but otherwise human adjacent. They snatched him up and named him Jacko. And it's unclear what they did with him after that, so I'm going to assume they dressed him up in some overalls and put him to work. And then he brings up folklore from Europe and North and South America that would indicate that these critters sometimes abducted humans and impregnated them. He even suggests that as they were driven towards extinction, they were compelled to mate with humans due to lack of members of their own species, and that they went virtually extinct as we industrialized more and started to live in cities because we were harder to grab. It's flat Earth, but also round Earth. This theory suggests that we live on a gigantic ice ball the size of Jupiter. Round. But that Earth as we know it is just a flat thing on the surface of it. Like our oceans comprise a big pond, and our continents are islands in the pond. And there would be a bunch of these ponds. And our sun just hovers around above our pond. So presumably there are 100 suns just rattling around up there. And don't even get me started on the gravity situation. This infographic is pretty much the only thing you can find about this theory. And that graphic is most likely satirical and is used to make fun of the ice wall flat earthers, aka people who believe we live on a flat disk surrounded by a wall of ice. And that's why travel to Antarctica is so limited, so we don't go down there and look at the wall. Certainly not because of conservation efforts or the fact that it's kind of dangerous to get there. And then there's the even wilder version in which there are a ton of consecutive ice rings and we're just in this little part in the middle. Or God forbid, this situation. Have these people ever been on a plane? Just wondering. I was reading this as macaroni death ray every time I skimmed over it in the chart. Back in the old days, Archimedes kind of made a death ray. But it was kind of the same vibe as the weird neighbor kid who sets stuff on fire with a magnifying glass. But back in the 20s and 30s, death rays were all the rage. Everybody and their mother was trying to make one. And you know who supposedly made one? Ya boy Nikola Tesla. He supposedly used his Tesla coil to draw energy from the ionosphere. But there's a lot of controversy around Tesla's work anyway. A lot of folks believe that a good chunk of his research was confiscated by the government for reasons. I once ran across a TikTok where somebody built a giant Tesla coil in their yard, and that thing was terrifying. They cooked a hot dog with it. I'm not sure if that's something that everybody saw or if that was just my For You page being kind of weird like it does. It was 10 times worse than the tunnel lady. Guglielmo Marconi was an Italian electrical engineer mostly known for his invention of the radio. And he was trying to make a death ray using radio waves to present to Mussolini, but he never perfected it. As of 2014, the US has something death ray adjacent. It's a laser weapon system attached to a ship for short-range defense. The main benefit of the thing over more traditional weapons are that you can fire it off a bunch of times in quick succession, and that it's more cost-effective because you aren't having to launch an actual physical projectile every time. They were apparently testing chemical lasers in the 1980s, but they were way too dangerous for the crews operating them. This newer one is a less powerful solid-state laser. The use of laser weapons is not particularly widespread, but they are trying to develop a version they can stick onto F-35s. So that's something. You know that saying about how infinite monkeys with infinite typewriters could eventually write Shakespeare? That's kind of how I feel about this entry. Just after my brain finished recovering from the Council of 13 episode. In the time between 1999 and early September 2001, some guy with the username was doling out 9/11 predictions. Primarily on Usenet, which was a early precursor to forums. On September 11th, 1998, he posted, Solog says that on 9/11 there will be a great emergency in Washington, D.C. Another guarantee from Solog, the god of one. Read it and weep, morons. And then he didn't really have anything else to say until August 31st, 2001, when an account by the name posted in the same group, something is going to happen tomorrow. This is a witness against everyone in this news group. I hate this news group and everyone in it sucks. Repent. You are all evil liars. Do not be so evil and be holy. You are going to get me killed because of the truth of my mouth. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen until it does, because an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. And then again, on September 4th, since when do I post prophecies other than world-ending cataclysmic ones? Wait 7 days and then maybe I'll answer this post. You see, I'm going away in 7 days, and you may not hear from me again. And people for some reason think that those were also from Solog. He's made some other, correct-ish prophecies about things like the Oklahoma City bombing and Katrina. But I mean, we've got people on the internet dishing out unfounded doomsday prophecies all the time. Statistically, somebody's bound to hit on something eventually. Most of the things I can find online about his super good and correct prophecies have been written by Solog himself. Oh, and I found his Instagram where he posts fetishy images of women smoking huge cigars, doodles of occult symbols, and NFTs of things like Donald Trump wearing a crown. He also made some other prophecies about things like a giant flood wiping out 75% of the Earth's population in 2014. Here we are. Why were people in Neolithic Europe setting their houses on fire? Starting as early as 6,500 BC and lasting until 2000 BC, people in this area of Europe would periodically burn down the entire village. Researchers aren't positive why they were doing this, but they're pretty sure it wasn't an accident. And then a theory started to form when archaeologists found mass grave sites with evidence of Yersinia pestis, the plague. These civilizations may have figured out that setting everything on fire might have prevented the spread of disease. But for them, it was likely more symbolic and became somewhat of a tradition. Interestingly, the buildings were made of mud and essentially turned into shards of pottery as if they were fired in a kiln. Modern experiments have been conducted to simulate an accidental fire originating from somewhere like the kitchen, but it's been shown to cause very minimal damage to the structure, only burning the thatched roof and firing less than 1% of the clay walls. Attacks by enemies would likely yield a similar result. It's hypothesized that it would have required a lot of additional kindling to be placed all around the houses to create as much fired ceramic debris as was found at these sites. If not for eliminating disease, some archaeologists suggest that these cultures may have had an animistic view towards objects, and thus burned homes in order to signify the end of their usable life, in order to rebuild on the site or, in a way, allow for the spirit of the home to be reincarnated. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. Or was she? She was. Joan of Arc is considered to be the patron saint of France. Back in the 1400s, she claims to have been divinely guided to aid France as a military leader in spite of traditional gender roles. Upon being captured by the English and tried for heresy, they claimed that her wearing men's clothes constituted blasphemy and that her visions were actually demonic in nature. She was subsequently convicted and burned at the stake at the age of 19. At the age of 19, I was complaining about writing a 5-page paper for history, eating curly fries in my computer science class, and showing up to my 8 a.m. geography lecture in pajamas. Following her death, the verdict was eventually overturned in 1456, and Joan was declared a martyr for her religious conviction, and she went on to be canonized by the Roman Catholic Church in 1920. Scholars suspect any number of causes for her visions, from schizophrenia or epilepsy to ergot poisoning. which you may recall happening to Scully in that one episode of X-Files where she had a midlife crisis and got a nasty, sketchy back alley tattoo. But, ooh, what if they actually burned someone else at the stake? There were some imposters who popped up later claiming to be Joan of Arc, but of course people are like, what if they burned an imposter instead? But that's super unlikely because she was imprisoned for a while beforehand and there were actually multiple witnesses at the execution that verified her identity. A missing commercial flight that was never found. And no, I'm not talking about Malaysia 370. On August 2nd, 1947, a British South American Airways flight took off from Argentina bound to Chile with 6 passengers and 5 crew, but it never made it. Investigators searched the determined crash area, but could not find any debris. No sign of the plane or its passengers. The plane was being piloted by a decorated British Royal Air Force pilot, but all of the crew members had fairly good records of military service and should have known what was going on up there. The crash occurred during the last leg of a flight that took off in London, carrying passengers from Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and Palestine, from the river to the sea, one of whom was a diplomatic courier. The flight took off in Argentina at 1:46, and at 5:41 they radioed the tower in Santiago telling them to expect them at 5:45. But due to whatever happened in the intervening 4 minutes, they never showed up. The last message received from the plane was the word Stendec repeated twice in Morse code. And nobody is certain what that means. To list off a few possible theories. 1. The crew were suffering from hypoxia and misspelled descent. 2. It was an obscure code used by World War II pilots meaning something along the lines of severe turbulence encountered, now descending, emergency crash landing. And 3, the most likely, is that they were freaking out and messed up the spacing in the Morse code. That it was intended to be the code for the airport, SCTI, followed by the letters AR, meaning over. And it wasn't until the late 90s that a couple of hikers stumbled upon traces of the wreckage in a thawing glacier. After thorough investigation, it was determined that the plane was still traveling at cruising speed and had the landing gear retracted when it made a head-on collision with the mountain, which is consistent with the crew becoming disoriented by heavy cloud cover and just smacking that thing straight into the ground. That they had begun their descent on the assumption that they had already passed the mountain range. And it's suspected that the crash caused an avalanche, which relocated the wreckage and buried it. However, some still believe that it was taken down as a way to destroy whatever documents the courier was carrying. Or that it was UFOs, because it's always gotta be UFOs on here. An 8,000-year-old bog full of human remains. We love to see it. If you know anything about bog bodies, you probably associate them with certain parts of Europe. But nope, this entry takes place in Florida. And if you don't know anything about them, a peat bog is a specific type of freshwater wetland environment containing decaying, mossy vegetation. They tend to have high levels of acidity and low oxygen concentration. As a result of these conditions, human and animal remains can remain preserved to varying degrees depending on the location of the bog. I'm talking skin, hair, and clothing left on bodies from thousands of years ago. And archaeologists investigating Windover Pond, just outside Orlando in the 1980s, happened to find over 160 of them. They found some of the earliest instances of complex woven cloth, as well as preserved brain tissue that allowed them to sequence the body's DNA. And some of the bodies also provided new information about ancient societies, including evidence that they provided long-term care for elderly and disabled members, which goes against previous assumptions. Aside from providing researchers with a unique opportunity to study ancient cultures, bogs also function as a carbon sink, which mitigates climate change, so tell your local wetland thank you. A common physical symptom reported in UFO incidents. It's John Keel again, from the Bigfoot video last week. The guy who wrote about UFOs a lot, for Playboy. He defines eye burn as searing of the cornea or other parts of the eye by intense UV and infrared light, a frequent ailment among UFO observers, results in swelling of the eyelids, burning and itching sensation in and around the eyes, and watering. In one instance that occurred in the Florida Everglades in 1952, Scoutmaster Sonny DeVerger was driving his Boy Scout troop home when they saw a bright flash of light. Believing it to be a downed aircraft, he pulled over and entered the woods with a machete. He left the boys with instructions to go to a nearby farmhouse for help if he hadn't returned in 15 minutes. Entering a clearing in the brush, he was hit by a super nasty smell and felt like he was being watched. He felt a radiant heat from above and looked up to see a hovering aircraft. It was circular, made of a dull black metal, and the underside appeared to glow. He was then struck by a red light, holding up his arms to shield his face before losing consciousness. When he awoke, lying against a tree, his eyes burned and he couldn't see properly. He managed to scramble through the woods and find his way back to the road as he regained his vision. The police were waiting as the boys had seen the flash of red light and noticed that Sonny's flashlight had gone out, so they ventured to the farm to alert the authorities. Police reports indicate that the hair on the Scoutmaster's arms was singed and he had minor burns. Foliage samples were taken from the area and showed damage consistent with being exposed to heat around 300 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a 1940s medical device that did, nothing. If you want to buy one of these things and enjoy all the health benefits of nothing, that'll be $900. It even had Quack in the title of the listing. The chroma ray was the main device, and the foca ray was that thing. The device consisted of a tripod-supported, somewhat barrel-shaped housing, slightly larger than one's head, and containing a 100-watt clear spotlight bulb with a reflector and a condenser system for projecting a diverging beam of light through any of 7 dial-mounted color filters. Seen here. The point of the thing was to be aimed at a patient, and the foca ray attachment was meant to concentrate the beam into a specific area. It was a colorful light. They put you near a colorful light.
For your health.
Or they could give you charged water, which is water that sat near the colorful light for a little while. And the device came with this manual that lets you know which color corresponded to hundreds of ailments. Brush your teeth, put on your pajamas, prepare your bedside water cup for when you're thirsty at 3 a.m., and tuck yourself in. I'm reading you a bedtime story. It's not Taily Poe. I'm sorry. I think we're under a tornado warning right now. We're actually skipping 150 because it's literally, what if all history prior to the French Revolution is made up? That's the whole thing. Stupid! Now, this creepypasta was lost at some point, I guess. And apparently there's a longer version of it that's still lost, but, I'm just gonna read the short version to you. This is meant to take place in the US, but the author is very clearly Australian, so I'm going to be swapping out some words like petrol and servo. For her birthday, I took my girl Katie to Arizona so we could stay with some friends of hers and spend a few weeks partying and getting crazy and stuff before heading back to school for the year. We drove up in my dad's car. It's a really old Ford and it's pretty beat up. The road there was bumpy and long. Our relationship seemed at its strongest on the road. We were really in love. That was the first time I realized that. I had never truly been in love before. We were about halfway there when we realized we were going to run out of gas long before the nearest town. Katie's head was out the window, sunglasses on in the blistering heat. Nothing but wild desert landscape to be seen in all directions. We became frantic. We hadn't seen another car on the road in almost an hour. What if we broke down here in the middle of the desert with no food or water and no one out there to find us? I sped up slightly, driven by these fears. It was then that we came across a gas station, smack in the middle of nowhere. Dry, empty, nowhere. It was in an old, worn-down service station. Long yellow grass blew in the breeze beneath it. Outside were 2 rusted gas pumps. At first, we didn't know if it was occupied. It seemed so lifeless. But as we pulled up and saw the gas stains in the dirt, we were convinced otherwise. Katie started refilling the car, and I went inside to pay and grab some snacks for the road. When I first went to open the door, it was jammed. This perturbed me, so I looked up to check and was reassured that the store was open, according to the torn sign that hung in between dull yellow curtains at the window. I pushed harder, and with effort, got into the shop. Inside, it was totally abandoned and left to ruin. Complete aisles lay on the ground, the fridges were smashed, and broken glass covered the floor. Despite the brightness outside, the interior of the gas station was dark and bitterly cold. Then there came, from behind me, this quiet weeping like a child. I felt my heart race. It was coming from the back room. I stepped over the smashed glass and twisted metal remnants on the floor, broken tiles where patches of grass had grown through. I ran my hand along the wall and felt the overgrown ivy beneath my fingers. There came the crying again, and now I was facing the back room door. I pushed the door open and it creaked with rust in its hinges. Inside there lay several wooden steps down into the basement. It was pitch black, and the smell was horrific. The drip drop of water alerted me to the fact that the basement was flooded. The water was up to my knees. Again, there came the crying, and a small splash in the far corner of the basement. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" I started approaching the corner. The smell was horrible, and the cold water was getting to me. The sobbing was getting louder. In the corner, I swore I saw something move amongst the shadows. "Hello?" I called out again. "What's wrong?" I finally reached the corner. Still dark. I had to bend down to avoid the pipes, which leaked down my back and trickled down my spine. The figure in front of me was very small and dark, hunched over, sobbing quietly, head in its hands. "Why are you down here?" I whispered. Then it stopped moving completely. It was totally still. All noise seemed to cease but for the quiet dripping of a broken pipe. I outstretched my arm to touch its tiny shoulder, but then it began to slowly turn in my direction to look me in the eye. As its face swiveled around to look into mine, I remember screaming and swinging my head up in recoil, cracking it on the pipes above. The face was white as a sheet, pale like a hideous moving mask. The eyes and mouth were completely black holes, huge and widening even as I looked at them. They were so huge they almost consumed its entire face. As I desperately tried to escape, it splashed towards me at rapid speed, uncurling its long, thin fingers. It was wailing now, staring into me with its huge black eyes as I scrambled up the stairs with great difficulty. I felt my legs begin to give way beneath me. It sprinted out of the water and up the stairs towards me. I slammed the door, flipped the lock, and tore out of the store into our old Ford. Katie began to laugh when she saw me, jeans wet, trembling, sweat soaking my chest, but I grabbed her and screamed to drive. For about half an hour, I could barely tell her what happened in the store. She listened and gave me a look of sheer horror when I finally gave in and told her everything. She pulled the car over to the side of the road and began to cry herself. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "I saw something while you were gone. When you were in the store, I was just putting the pump back when I saw this little girl and a man. Her father, I guess. The father stared at me with blank eyes and a hanging jaw, but the girl, oh God, the girl. She was staring straight at me, grinning with this huge smile that just stretched so far across her face. I couldn't see any hair on her head, and her skin was so dark, unnaturally dark, like a shadow, and her smile just shone through the window. I convinced myself it was a trick of the eye and looked away. When I looked back, they were gone. Then a little while later, you came back out." The storm is getting going outside. You can tell it got a lot darker. I need to get my ring light. It was dusk by now. We had nowhere to stay. We had not traveled nearly as much as we hoped to that day, and the nearest motel meant going back past the gas station. So we just drove up from the roadside into a little clearing, where people camp sometimes. We had obviously come the night after a big party. There was broken glass everywhere. When we arrived, however, it was empty. After a while, I tried to reassure Katie that we were okay. I calmed her down, put my arms around her, and we started to kiss. I moved to get closer to her when suddenly she screamed. "It's her! It's her!" she screeched, fumbling to start the engine. I turned in time to witness a small dark face, grinning literally ear to ear. It was crawling into the car through my open window, with its limbs splayed out like an insect. It had too many limbs. Way too many long arms. The fingers feeling my face like antennae. We sped off, back down the road. Back on the road, nothing seemed right. There were no stars. That was what I noticed first. I was too shaken to think much of it, but there were no clouds that could be blotting them out. There was just the vast night sky, devoid of light. Then a few minutes after we had been driving forward, still sweating and breathing heavy, we passed the gas station. My heart skipped a beat. The gas station was at least a half hour away in the opposite direction. All the lights were on, and I saw the door sliding open. As we shot past it, Katie was in such hysterics she found it hard to keep driving. We stopped the car in the middle of the road. I decided we should switch seats so that I could drive. She shuffled across from her seat to mine, and I opened the door to get out. As soon as I was outside, the foul stench from the basement overwhelmed me. I gagged, then vomited beside the car. It was then that I noticed the runner. A pale white thing sprinting towards us, its limbs practically a blur. I could make out no face. How long had it been following us, running after us in the night? I got in the driver's seat as quickly as possible. We drove off again, not talking. Katie whimpered, and I silently prayed. Then we passed the gas station again. The door was open now. There were two figures standing in the door, waiting. As we forced ourselves on, we both became aware of a soft, barely audible weeping in the back seat. Neither of us dared to turn around. "Ignore it," I whispered, my trembling hands gripping the steering wheel. Katie was curled in the fetal position, holding her head in her hands. The wailing increased, becoming extremely loud, ear-piercing, and horrific. Finally, I ordered myself to end it, and looked behind me. For a split second, I thought it was a girl, in a white dress, looking back at me. But she was gone as soon as she had appeared. I checked the seats carefully. There was nothing. In my tiredness and fear, I had completely lost track of the road. I drove on, all through the night, and Katie whimpered. I touched her once, but she screamed. I never tried again after that. The noises from the back seat started up again. We passed the gas station twice more. The people at the door were closer every time. The faintest sliver of red light had begun to settle on the horizon. It was still dark as hell, but at least I was able to see the road ahead of me. Katie had been silent, face concealed under her hands for some time. I decided to check the time, so I turned on the radio. At first, there was only static. Instead of time or anything at all, the digital clock simply appeared blank. I fiddled with the dial, trying to change the station. In between the static, I found only one audible channel. It had a high-pitched buzz in the background. A man was muttering names and numbers under his breath. 29, Lucy. 30, Adam. 31, Katie. I switched back to static. I knew my name was next. When we got to Katie's friend's house, it was morning. It was overcast, and everywhere had the smell of rain. Her friends weren't home. Katie's friends lived way out in the country, with no one else around for miles. The grass was climbing the walls outside. How long have they been gone? This is our second mysterious explosion. We need to start a tally. So that's 2 jetpack men, 2 explosions, and at least 4 rascals. On the 6th of September, 2014, something went boom in Nicaragua. The official story is that it was a meteorite impact, but nobody saw a meteor, and cameras didn't record a meteor, and there were no meteor bits found at the site. On the night of the incident, witnesses reported a loud noise, a large dust cloud, and a burning smell. That was me, sorry. Then a large crater was found close to the runway at the airport, specifically near the area that is used by the Nicaraguan Air Force. And by big crater, I mean 39 feet or 12 meters wide and 16 feet or 5 meters deep. And whatever it was picked up as seismic activity by 24 earthquake monitoring stations in the area. Scientists visiting the site described tiny mirror-like particles lining the walls of the crater and unusual compacted debris at the bottom. Specimens were sent off for testing, but the results were never publicized. To me, that just sounds like the military was doing something secret, but then they kind of messed up the secret part. Imagine being out of town when this happened. According to this urban legend, an entire village in the Chinese mountains disappeared overnight in 1987. Nobody remained, not even the animals. While this sort of thing isn't entirely unheard of, take this with a heaping tablespoon of salt, because the main source propagating this story is Falun Gong, which is the cult that brings Shen Yun to a town near you. Supposedly, in a secret military exercise dubbed Operation Nightcat, a bunch of troops were dispatched to this rural village in order to relocate everyone under the cover of darkness. There are also rumors of an underground nuclear facility inside the mountains. One of the articles I was reading mentioned a failed missile test in 1996 that resulted in a cover-up that included relocating an entire village, with the primary record of the incident coming from foreign witnesses. So I guess that would imply that the disappearance was related to an accident at the nuclear facility? But of course there's a version of the story where everyone was abducted by aliens. And apparently nobody was like, oh yeah, I used to live there, we moved to that town. Some sort of little goblin? Or perhaps a rascal? Or just a stupid toy? Watch out, Mooncube, this one might dethrone you as stupidest entry on this iceberg. It was this grandma posting on a forum like, ooh, I took this photo of my grandkids and there was a little goblin in it. And everyone was like, ma'am, that's a Spider-Man toy? Oh, no, it's not. I know they don't have a toy like that. And I know they only brought coloring books to my house that day. And commenters were like, it's literally this exact Spider-Man toy. They even posed it to look exactly like it did in the photo. But oh no, even if it was a toy, it ended up there via paranormal means. Just how long have aliens been abducting people? So Betty and Barney Hill, who you may remember from one of my UFO Week videos, are considered to be one of the first alien abduction cases. Paleo-abduction is a term coined by Jerome Clark for any incidents that happened prior to that could be interpreted as a UFO encounter. Not specifically Paleolithic, just from the past. On November 27, 1896, 3 Stockton, California residents claimed to have been followed around by some tall, pale, thin humanoids who tried to kidnap them. And there were stories scattered through some publications in the 1950s of people being snatched up by flying saucers. The idea of paleo-abductions tries to tie in a lot of mythology like the Fae from Europe or the Duende from Mexico, and that those were actually early alien sightings. Not to mention the flying saucers you occasionally see in the background of Renaissance paintings. And I guess whatever's going on here. For my own entertainment, I'm gonna assume everything happened exactly as depicted. I was one of those, I'm gonna grow up to be a marine biologist kids. And here we are. I'm not a marine biologist. Please tell me your favorite sea creature in the comments. I know it's a pain, but we're skipping 156 too. Was Hinduism invented? Which essentially says that Hinduism was not like a unified set of beliefs until colonizers showed up and said it was. And the main book on the topic costs $39 for the ebook. So stay unexplained, damn. Now, did you know that some really large fish start out as really tiny little larvae? Such as my good friend the sunfish. The adult is a flat, lazy bastard the size of a Mini Cooper.
Look at the little babies. The little babies.
Ain't that precious? Apparently the mommy sunfish can release millions of eggs, but they're scarcely seen. Same with the larva. But to be fair, there are a ton of generic little crumbs floating around the ocean. It just so happens some of them turn out to be little guys. I think that's what a scrutiny is. And this little thingy turns into this super long harbinger of doom. According to superstitions, seeing an oarfish in shallow water is a sign of impending tsunami or earthquake. But because this is the iceberg, I'm sure the implication is that sea serpents exist and they start out as little baby crumbs. Why make up sea monsters when the Humboldt squid is right there? It's a confusing old manuscript. This old book randomly surfaced in Hungary in the 19th century. Full Metal Alchemist! Full Metal Alchemist. It's named after the city it was stored in up until it was donated to the Hungarian Academy of Sciences by the count that owned it. And nobody's sure where it came from prior to that. Many have studied it over the years, and nobody's really sure what it's trying to communicate either. The book itself is described as having 448 paper pages measuring 12 by 10 centimeters, with each page having between 9 and 14 rows of symbols, which may or may not be letters. Beside the text, there are 87 illustrations that include religious and military scenes. The crude illustrations seem to indicate an environment where Christian, pagan, and Muslim religions coexist. The number of symbols used in the book is estimated to be just under 800, which is 10 times more than any known alphabet. Studies of the paper indicate that it was most likely made in Venice in 1530s. But who knows how long the paper may have sat around until it was used. There are quite a few hypotheses, from isolated monks to ancient languages to some kind of cipher to just some random stuff that somebody made up because it was boring back then. What do you know about the Mandela Effect? So yeah, that's exactly what this title had me picturing. But it's apparently a Mandela Effect situation. Or the person who originally broached this topic on 4chan just had no clue what they were talking about. The original poster was insisting that the Statue of Liberty is located on Ellis Island and not Liberty Island. It's not called the Statue of Ellis, is it? Anyway, for those of you who are unfamiliar, I'll take you down the Mandela Effect rabbit hole. Just a little bit, just like a few steps into the hole. The name originates from the fact that a lot of people are under the impression that Nelson Mandela passed away in the 1980s in prison, as opposed to 2013. And it starts to digress into alternate realities or parallel universes splitting and merging, glitches in the Matrix, etc. It kind of plays on quantum physics. There are quite a few examples, but one of the more notable ones is the Berenstain Bears. This is apparently the correct version, but I'm from this universe, I think. And this is supposed to be the correct version, but I am also definitely from the Cornucopia universe. Are Australian cryptids really that much more concerning than their regular wildlife? The yowie is a creature known throughout Australian folklore. A tall, hairy humanoid with large feet that lives out in the woods. Where have we heard that before? Sometimes depicted looking just straight up like Bigfoot, and sometimes like this Titan thing. Anyway, in today's entry, a woman living in a remote rental property in Tarzali, Queensland, claims that the area is infested with 3 whole yowies. And some other thing. According to her description, he was a strange-looking pale white guy with sunken, hollow cheekbones, and it used to just squat down, sit there, and stare at her. It sure sounds like our friend, the Crawler. Her family would hear things growling outside at night and always felt like somebody was watching them through their bathroom window. The landlord said she's full of BS and chalked her encounters up to possums. Not these. These. Not sure how, but Australia ended up with the more benign-looking version. Must have been some kind of mix-up. The Australian version of a Squatch hunter said yowies like to appear to single women and their children living in isolated areas. That'll do it. Not sure about the white boy, though. Did this ship's crew find the lost city of Atlantis? Do you want to learn about volcanoes? In 1882, a merchant steamship under the name SS Jesmond found what they thought was Atlantis. But this far into the iceberg, I think we're all familiar with the level of credibility of tales coming out of the 19th century or earlier. They were traveling out of France, bound for New Orleans with a cargo full of dried fruit, when the captain spotted something. A plume of mud bubbling at the ocean's surface and a ton of dead fish. And the next morning, there was an island in its place. And it was a big boy, 30 miles across, with an active volcano. So far, this just sounds like how islands form under non-anomalous circumstances. Here's a video of that exact thing happening. There are 3 ways this can happen. A tectonic plate subducts, aka slides under its neighbor. 2 neighboring plates split apart. And the third one, because I can't show it with my hands, a plume of magma penetrates upward through the Earth's crust, and as the tectonic plate above it moves over it, it creates a chain of islands. The volcanic eruption below the ocean's surface causes lava to cool and build up and pile on itself until it breaches the ocean's surface, and that's how a landmass is created. Here's a map of the borders of tectonic plates as well as volcanic hotspots. And based on my research, I think they were right there. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt for now. When they landed on the island, they noticed it was barren and made of black basalt, and there was steam rising up from underground. This is basalt, and if you want to learn how the volcano makes things like this, let me know in the comments. While exploring the island, the crew found artifacts such as carved statues, pottery, and arrowheads. And they were all covered in barnacles, which to me sounds like some stuff that was just hanging out on the ocean floor for a while and then got stirred up by an eruption. But the primary reason they believed it to be Atlantis is because they found a sword made of gold and copper alloy, similar to what Plato described. But I'm like 99% sure this was just a bunch of people who saw an island form and freaked out because they had no idea what was happening. What's up with that hat that the Pope wears? Mitre is the official name of this thing. The only reason I knew that beforehand is because I listened to Ghost. I don't really think it looks like a fish. I think they mean it's like the mouth going like... The official history of the mitre is that it was developed as a variation of a different kind of hat that the popes used to wear prior to the 11th century. It used to be kind of rounded, but it's gotten pointier over time. The hat, as well as the rest of the pope's outfit, fall into the category of vestments, which serve a symbolic purpose. And to be fair, some kind of head covering is pretty standard in like every religion. Don't forget the ladies. And the Catholics have a ton of them. And sure, a lot of aspects of modern Christianity were built upon older pagan traditions, but this theory asserts that the Pope's entire deal is based on an ancient fish god, and that 9/11 was a ritual sacrifice for the fish god. And amphibians and sea-dwelling mammals were put here by aliens. Catholicism does legitimately have some fish symbolism, but most of it is based on the Apostle Peter, the fisherman. If you haven't watched the Roswell episode from UFO Week, go do that and come back. July 1947, in a military hospital in Roswell, New Mexico, something unusual is happening. Unfamiliar personnel scurry around frantically, and the regular staff are told to go home. There are some whispers about a crash, and some sort of mysterious craft. Miriam Bush served as secretary to the hospital administrator, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren. She had a security clearance, so she was allowed to stay. Apparently, this hospital did not have a morgue on site and contracted with a private mortuary known as Ballard Funeral Services. And Ballard Funeral Services received some very strange calls from the hospital that day. Inquiries about child-sized caskets and questions about embalming. And at the same time, the hospital ordered a very large quantity of dry ice from a nearby dairy. In the evening after work, Miriam sat down to dinner with her parents and siblings. She was described as being agitated and distant before suddenly running to her room, distraught and sobbing. When they checked in on her, she recounted this story. Lieutenant Colonel Warren had ushered her into an exam room, wanting to show her something. Inside, lying on gurneys, she saw several small grayish figures with unusually large heads and big black eyes. Her family was unable to console her, and eventually she fell asleep. The next morning, she found that the hospital had constructed a temporary morgue concealed by a tent and surrounded by a fence. Throughout the day, staff were being called in and warned not to speak about anything they saw the previous day. That evening, she essentially told her family, "I told you nothing, don't bring it up again." She very suddenly got married to a man she barely knew, and then remained in this suspicious, loveless marriage for 40 years. After the divorce, she became increasingly paranoid, seemingly related to what she saw in 1947. She believed she was being followed, and her sister was under the impression that the marriage had something to do with all of this. And then she was found dead in a hotel room outside of Los Angeles, seemingly strangled with a plastic bag. Her body was covered with cuts and bruises that would indicate a struggle. Her death was ruled a suicide. This is kind of the vibe for today's entry. The source for this one is a website called Bad Archaeology, so we're off to a great start. Apparently the British Museum is in possession of a Neanderthal skull that was found in 1921 in a mine in what is now modern-day Zambia. I feel kind of disingenuous calling it a Neanderthal, even though that's what the theory calls it. It's actually from a different species of prehistoric hominid, and this particular specimen is known as the Rhodesian man. He's likely related to the subspecies heidelbergensis, which is one of our closest ancient ancestors. And his skull has this weird 8mm hole in the side of it. And the parietal bone is shattered on the opposite side. The hole does not appear to have been made by what the website calls a cold projectile, such as a spear. It looks like a gunshot. This thing is between 125,000 and 300,000 years old. Guns are not that old. The two absolutely BS theories are as follows. 1. The skull isn't nearly as old as it seems, and the individual was shot by Europeans. But carbon dating and everything else we know about the skull contradicts that. And 2. There were somehow Paleolithic rifles that nobody knew about. And that's... yeah. Apparently, whatever it was didn't actually kill the individual. The wound had evidently started to heal. The bullet hole was most likely the result of some sort of serious infection, possibly causing an abscess. And the individual most likely died from complications such as sepsis. And as for the so-called exit wound, the damage to the parietal bone most likely occurred after Bro was already a skeleton. It's the hottest new tattoo trend. Open up! A year ago, user technical_cookie2712 posted on the Ask Docs subreddit on behalf of his friend, 42M. This buddy had been having a lot of trouble with acid reflux and was given an endoscopy. They put a camera on a tube down your throat. This was his first ever procedure. No prior surgeries. I had a moment like, how do you get to 42 without ever having surgery? Girl, you are chronically ill. Your experiences are not universal. I'll say things like, you know when you're getting an MRI? And the person I'm talking to is like, no. Anyway, while rooting around in this guy's throat, the doctor found numbers printed on his esophagus. I'm about to show the photos, but just heads up, they're a little yucky. At first glance, that's really weird. Some of the Redditors suspected that it was ink bleed on the photo itself, but that was ruled out. It's not very exciting, but the reasonable conclusion is that it came from his medication. Prior to most surgical procedures, you're instructed to not eat or drink anything after a certain time. So that morning, he most likely took his medication without water, it got stuck in his throat, and anything that was printed on the pill transferred. Like silly putty.